Tobias had always believed wars ended up in archives because no one wanted to remember them properly. They arrived as half-burned reports, contradictory testimonies, and footnotes that argued with one another like old scholars trapped in a room with bad air recycling. That was how he preferred them, quiet, settled, incapable of interrupting his thoughts. The Imperial Archive Vault was designed for that kind of peace. The ceiling projected a simulated sky from a planet that no longer existed. The air smelled faintly of dust and ionized metal, and the shelves hummed softly as they rearranged themselves in response to his queries. Tobias sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by floating data shards, muttering to himself as if the ancient generals encoded in them might answer back out of embarrassment. "The problem with you," he told a flickering hologram of a centuries-old campaign map, "is that you assume everyone is competent." The map did not apologize. He was mid-sentence in a marginal note, something sharp but polite about recurring flanking errors, when the vault lights dimmed. At first he assumed the system was correcting its cycle, but then the air shifted. Not failed, not broken. Attentive. Tobias looked up just as the archive's access glyphs froze in place. A voice echoed through the chamber, calm and unhurried. "Historian Tobias Hale, please stand." He did not stand. He blinked instead, waiting for the sentence to make sense. When it stubbornly refused, he scrambled to his feet, sending two data shards spinning into each other. They collided with a faint chime that sounded suspiciously judgmental. "Yes," he said to no one in particular. "That's me. I'm standing, technically." A corridor unfolded from the far wall, smooth and seamless, a clear sign that someone with more authority than Tobias had decided his afternoon needed rearranging. He gathered his data pads, attempted to smooth his robe, failed, and stepped forward. As he walked, he tried to recall any crimes he might have committed recently. Intellectual ones were plentiful. Political ones, he hoped, were minimal. The corridor opened into the War Council chamber. Tobias stopped so abruptly that the doorframe nearly claimed his nose. The room was vast, tiered like an amphitheater, filled with holographic starfields layered over tactical projections. Armored figures stood in clusters, voices overlapping in clipped, aggressive tones. Generals, admirals, strategists, people whose hobbies likely involved moving fleets instead of footnotes. At the center of it all stood a woman in pale ceremonial armor, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested supreme confidence or absolute exhaustion. She looked human enough at first glance. Tall, composed, her expression controlled to the point of neutrality. Then she turned slightly and the light caught the elegant length of her ears, tapering back in a way no humans ever had. Tobias felt his brain make a small, respectful adjustment. The Empress. Someone noticed him, then several someones did. The arguing faltered, not because Tobias was impressive, but because confusion has a way of demanding silence. "Who is that?" someone hissed. "Why is there a civilian here? Is he holding an archive pad?" Tobias raised one hand in a small apologetic wave, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be solved with manners. The Empress lifted her hand. Silence fell instantly. Not the uncomfortable kind, the dangerous kind. Tobias felt it settle on his shoulders like gravity deciding to take him seriously. She turned to him fully now. Her eyes were sharp, observant, and utterly uninterested in his discomfort. "You've been studying the Karset advance," she said. It was not a question. Tobias swallowed. "Yes, your radiance. Among other disasters." A murmur rippled through the chamber. One general frowned. Another looked offended on behalf of the word disasters. The Empress did not react. "The enemy fleet is executing a maneuver we have not seen in modern warfare," she continued. "My council believes it unprecedented." Tobias hesitated. Every instinct he had told him to retreat into academic caution, to soften the edges of his thoughts with disclaimers and uncertainty. Unfortunately, his mouth had a history of ignoring those instincts. "With respect," he said, "it's only unprecedented if you stop reading after the 3rd century." Someone scoffed audibly. The Empress tilted her head. Explain. Tobias took a breath. The formation they're using, rotational pressure with delayed reinforcement, appears innovative, but it's actually a near-perfect echo of the Virilan expansion campaign, which failed, catastrophically, mostly because the Virilans assumed their opponents would respond rationally. One of the admirals stepped forward. Are you suggesting we rely on a dead empire's mistakes to predict a living enemy? I'm suggesting, Tobias said carefully, that enemies tend to inherit their ancestors' pride along with their ships. A few quiet laughs escaped before their owners remembered where they were. The Empress's gaze never left Tobias. Something unreadable passed through her expression, interest, perhaps, or relief. And how did the Virilan campaign end? Tobias allowed himself a thin smile. With the complete collapse of their supply spine and a retreat so disorganized it became a cautionary tale, literally. I teach it to first-year students under the title, Why History is Laughing at You. Silence again. He braced for outrage. Instead, the Empress exhaled softly. Then it seems, she said, that while my generals prepare for a war of fire, you may have prepared for a war of memory. She turned to the council. I want his analysis integrated into our strategy. The room erupted. Tobias barely heard it. He was too busy realizing that his quiet afternoon among dead wars had just ended, and that history apparently had decided to interrupt him back. The generals argued for exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds before Tobias realized two things. First, no one was going to ask him to leave. Second, several highly decorated military leaders were now debating his existence as if he were a faulty piece of equipment that had appeared in the middle of the room without proper authorization. This is absurd, one of them said, his uniform edged with medals that caught the light aggressively. You cannot elevate an archivist over active command. Tobias cleared his throat. Historian, he corrected gently. Archivists are much more dangerous. They control access. No one laughed. The Empress did, very quietly. She moved to the central hollow table, its surface blooming into layered projections of star systems, fleet movements, and glowing probability arcs that shifted with every spoken word. Tobias approached cautiously, like someone stepping near an animal that might bite if startled. The table responded to his presence, adjusting its interface, recognizing his credentials. That alone earned him several dark looks. Show us, Zithara said. It struck Tobias then that she had not dismissed him, nor explained him. She had simply accepted that he belonged here now, which was far more terrifying than being escorted out. He activated his pad and dragged an ancient map into the present. The colors were muted, the data incomplete, scarred by time and loss. Against the polished modern projections, it looked almost embarrassed. This is the Virilan campaign, he said. They favored rotational pressure, beautiful, elegant, deeply smug. They believed complexity equaled superiority. A general snorted. It does. Only until someone refuses to play along, Tobias replied. He layered troop movements over the ancient map, aligning them with current enemy positions. The resemblance was uncanny. Even he felt a small chill, the kind historians got when patterns stopped being theoretical. Zithara leaned in, her long ears angling slightly back in concentration. You're saying the enemy expects us to counter with symmetrical force? Yes, Tobias said. They're betting we'll respond the way competent militaries always do. And we are a competent military, another voice snapped. Tobias smiled apologetically. That's the problem. A few officers shifted. One laughed despite himself, then coughed and pretended it was tactical analysis. Zithara gestured for Tobias to continue. They're overextending their supply spine, he said, highlighting glowing roots that pulsed faintly. Because historically, no one exploited it. The Virelans assumed honor-bound engagements. Their enemies assumed survival. Guess who adapted faster? Silence crept in again, this time uneasy. A strategist stepped forward. This relies on assumptions about enemy psychology. All strategy does, Tobias said. I just cheat by borrowing theirs from the dead. Zithra straightened. If we break their supply spine, they'll unravel, Tobias finished. Not immediately, slowly. Which is worse. Confusion spreads faster than fear. One of the admirals crossed his arms. And what makes you think this enemy hasn't studied their own history? Tobias paused. Because if they had, they wouldn't be doing this. That earned him a genuine laugh, sharp and surprised, from Zithra herself. The sound cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Several generals stiffened, as if laughter were an unauthorized maneuver. The meeting dissolved soon after, not into agreement, but into recalibration. Orders were issued carefully, couched in language that avoided admitting where the idea had come from. Tobias was ushered into a smaller chamber adjacent to the main hall, escorted by a guard who looked at him as though historians occasionally exploded. The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss. Zithra remained. Up close, she was more disarming. Not because she was kind, she wasn't, not exactly, but because she was attentive. Her presence felt focused, like gravity with intent. They will fight this, she said. Yes, Tobias agreed. Tradition usually does. She studied him for a moment. You're not afraid. He laughed, a little too loudly. Your radiance, I am terrified. I just come from a profession where terror is disguised as confidence. That seemed to please her. She circled the room, hands clasped behind her back. They question my authority daily. I was not trained as a general. I was educated. Tobias nodded. A scandalous background. They think I rely too much on counsel, she continued. That I hesitate. Hesitation, Tobias said, is often just thinking with better posture. She stopped and looked at him, truly looked at him. You don't belong here, she said. I've noticed. And yet, she went on, you see things they do not. Because I don't have to prove I'm strong, Tobias said. Just correct. A faint smile touched her lips. They will come for you. Yes, he said. That was implied in the glares. If you remain, she said, you will be blamed if this fails. And if it succeeds? She shrugged lightly. They will say it was inevitable. Tobias considered this, then sighed. History does love its convenient narratives. Zithra stepped closer. Will you stay? He looked at the holotable, at ancient failures whispering to the present, at a war repeating itself out of ignorance. Someone has to remind them how this ends, he said. I suppose it might as well be me. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. Then welcome to the most dangerous footnote in the Empire. Tobias smiled. I've always wanted to be cited. The war did not end with a decisive explosion or a heroic last stand. Tobias found this deeply unsatisfying from a narrative perspective, which he mentioned exactly once before Zithra informed him that reality did not care about his sense of drama. Instead, the war ended the way most things did when history was allowed to intervene properly, with confusion, embarrassment, and a slow realization on the enemy's part that they had already lost several days ago. The supply spine fractured precisely where Tobias said it would, not because the Empire struck harder, but because it struck differently. Fleets slipped past expected engagement zones. Communication relays were left intact just long enough to spread contradictory orders. Enemy commanders began arguing with one another across open channels, their rigid hierarchy unraveling under the weight of uncertainty. Tobias watched it unfold from the command gallery, arms folded, expression grimly satisfied. They're doing exactly what the Virulans did, he murmured. Denial, followed by anger, followed by the sudden invention of new doctrines that don't work. Zithra stood beside him, hands resting lightly on the railing. She looked calm, but Tobias had learned to recognize the subtle signs. Her ears angled slightly back, her posture too still. This mattered to her. Not just the war, but what it proved. A general approached, clearing his throat in a way that suggested he had practiced humility in private and disliked it intensely. "Your Radiance, the enemy is requesting a ceasefire channel." Zithara did not look away from the projections. "Already? They're citing logistical miscalculations." Tobias couldn't help himself. History is very rude like that. The general shot him a look, then reluctantly nodded. "Yes, it appears so." When the ceasefire was formalized, it was done quickly, efficiently, and with great care to avoid mentioning how close the Empire had come to disaster before a historian wandered into the room. Public statements credited strategic adaptability. Internal reports credited collective brilliance. No one credited Tobias, which was exactly how he knew things had truly changed. What did change was who stood beside Zithara when the council reconvened. This time, no one questioned his presence. There were still glares, of course. Resentment aged slowly. But there was also something new: calculation. Tobias had gone from inconvenience to liability to asset, and that unsettled people who preferred their power uncontested. After the final session, as the council dispersed, Zithara dismissed the guards and gestured for Tobias to follow her into the quieter wing of the palace. The halls here were older, lined with carved stone and softly glowing conduits that hummed with ancient technology. This part of the palace had seen many rulers pass through it. Very few had lingered. "You could leave now," Zithara said as they walked. "Your role is complete." Tobias considered that. Weeks ago he would have fled with gratitude and several footnotes. Now the thought felt unfinished. "I could," he said, "but then someone else would write the ending." She stopped and turned to him. "And you don't trust them?" "I don't trust anyone who thinks wars are won by fire alone," he said. "They tend to repeat themselves." A small smile appeared, unguarded and brief. "You've changed." "So have you," he replied. "You let someone tell you you were right." They reached a balcony overlooking the capital, the city lights stretching like constellations mapped onto the ground. For a long moment, neither spoke. "They will remember me as the Empress who listened," Zithara said finally. "Some will say that is weakness." "They said the same about scholars who questioned the gods," Tobias said. "Then they started using calendars." She laughed, soft and genuine, and the sound seemed to loosen something in the air between them. "You no longer speak like someone hiding behind history." Tobias thought about that, about how he had entered the war clutching the past like a shield, and how he now stood in the present without flinching. "I suppose I learned that knowledge isn't safer when it's quiet," he said. "It's just easier to ignore." Zithara faced him fully now. "I am forming a new advisory council," she said. "One that values memory as much as strength." Tobias raised an eyebrow. "You're going to make a lot of enemies." "I already have," she replied. "Now they'll have to argue with facts." He sighed theatrically. "I was hoping for a quiet life." "You had one," she said. "You chose otherwise." He smiled, accepting that. Somewhere along the way, the archives had stopped feeling like refuge and started feeling like foundation. As the city lights flickered below them, Tobias realized that for the first time, he wasn't just studying history, he was helping decide what it would remember.